Okay, ever catch yourself like walking into a room and you instantly size everyone up, and then somehow you end up feeling like you're the one who landed at the bottom of the ladder,
Yeah.
which we've all been there, right? But what if I told you those totally opposite extremes, feeling less than OR, like feeling like you're better than everyone else, are actually more connected than we think?
Hmm.
That's what we're diving into today, this whole tangled world of inferiority and superiority complexes. And you know I love a good brain puzzle, and, well, we're not just going to skim the surface here. You shared some really fascinating research with me about these complexes. I gotta say, some of it really surprised me.
Boy.
So let's start with the basics. When we talk about an inferiority complex, what are we actually talking about? It's got to be more than just a case of the Mondays, right?
Way more. We're not talking about just a bad Monday or even a bad week. It's much deeper than that. An inferiority complex is like this deeply ingrained belief that you are fundamentally like flawed or inadequate in some way. And it's not just a fleeting feeling. It doesn't just come and go. It's this persistent sense of not measuring up.
Mm.
And it impacts how someone sees themselves and how they interact with, well, everyone and everything else.
So it's like looking at yourself through one of those, distorted mirrors, right? Like it doesn't matter what you achieve, it never feels like enough.
Exactly. And you know where the research gets really interesting? When you look at the root causes, I mean, we hear all the time that these complexes stem from your childhood.
Right there.
And yeah, that's true. But it's a little more complex than that. Like if you think about parenting styles, some parenting styles can really like have a huge impact. For example, constant criticism. If you're a kid and you grow up hearing, you're not good enough, or why can't you be more like so-and-so, right? That can really create this like fertile ground for an inferiority complex to just like take root and grow.
It's like their sense of self-worth becomes totally externally driven. Like they're always dependent on other people's approval, always trying to meet these impossible standards. So then how does this whole thing, how does it actually show up later in life?
It can be incredibly subtle. That's what's so tricky about these complexes, right?
Yeah.
You don't always know what's happening. So, okay, imagine this. You're at a work meeting and you have this like awesome idea, but that voice in your head, the one shaped by like years of feeling inadequate, tells you all your coworkers are going to think it's a done idea.
Oh, I know that voice.
Right. So you just stay silent. It's this fear of judgment, this terror of screwing up. And here's the kicker that screw up. In their mind, it's going to confirm all those deeply held beliefs about themselves.
So they just avoid any challenge.
Yeah. They'd rather not try than try and fail.
It's like they get trapped in their own minds, held back by these like invisible bars of self-doubt. But here's where my brain went totally haywire. How does this feeling, this really deep-seated belief that you're not good enough, how does that morph into acting superior?
You know what that is?
Yeah.
Classic overcompensation.
Yeah.
It's like this, if you're carrying around all this inadequacy, all this feeling like you're not good enough, you're going to try to build yourself up on the outside to make up for it, to create this like facade of confidence and control.
So it's like building a giant fortress around your ego, so no one can see how vulnerable you really feel.
Yes. And that's where you'll see the name dropping, the constantly needing to be the center of attention or just completely dismissing anyone else's opinions or ideas. It's all just a way of saying, like, look at me, I'm important, I'm worthy. It's all to drown out that voice, that inner voice saying they're not good enough.
And the research supports this, right? It's not that people with superiority complexes are intentionally, like, trying to be jerks. It's more of this unconscious defense mechanism. It's actually kind of sad when you think about it.
Yeah. And we need to remember, these are all coping mechanisms. Are they healthy? No. But they're just a way to navigate a world that just feels incredibly invalidating. But here's the thing. It can get even more interesting.
Okay, lay it on me. I'm ready.
It's not as easy as someone being either inferior or superior. It's so much more complex than that.
Oh, here we go.
It's like this constant back and forth, this dance between the two, depending on the situation, how they're feeling that day, what's going on in their own heads.
So hold on. That totally changes how I think about this. It's not about like labeling people as one or the other, right? It's about understanding that it's fluid, it's dynamic, it can change.
Exactly. You got it. Think about it like a pendulum. Someone might be feeling super inferior when they feel like insecure, maybe in a new social setting or at work or something. But then they overcompensate and become really controlling in their relationships or dismissive because that's where they feel like they have to exert control.
Wow. So it really is like an emotional roller coaster with all these like peaks and valleys of confidence and insecurity, sometimes all at the same time. So how does this all play out in real life? What does this actually look like?
Okay, so let's say there's a kid, right? And they grow up and their parents are always praising them for being so intelligent, telling how smart they are. On the surface, you think, okay, positive reinforcement.
That makes sense.
But what actually happens is this kid, they internalize this message that their intelligence is directly tied to their self-worth. They become hyper-focused on their academics, on achievement. They get into all the best schools, land the high-powered job. But here's the problem. Any failure, any criticism, even something small like a comment from their boss, sends them into a total tailspin.
Because their whole persona, right, that identity they carefully built of the smart one, it's all suddenly at risk.
Exactly. And that's when they swing to the other side. Suddenly they're dismissive of their coworkers. They have to prove they're still the smartest person in the room. And that can mean sabotaging relationships or opportunities. It's a mess.
So they spend their lives trying to outrun this fear that they're not good enough, but it always catches up to them. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You got it. And it's a vicious cycle. And as if it couldn't get more complicated, we also have to factor in how society plays into all of this.
Oh, 100%. It's like we live in this pressure cooker of comparison,
Right.
and we're constantly being told who and what we should be, what we should have achieved by now. And don't even get me started on social media.
Right. It's like everyone else's highlight reel, 24/7.
And we all know it's totally curated, filtered, and probably completely fake.
Yeah.
But it still gets in your head, you know?
It totally preys on our insecurities, making us feel like we're not good enough, not doing enough. And that can either fuel those feelings of inadequacy or trigger the overcompensation, leading us to create our own picture-perfect version of ourselves to show off to the world.
So what you're saying is we're all stuck on this hamster wheel of comparison and overcompensation, never quite feeling good enough. Man, this is kind of depressing.
It doesn't have to be. Here's the good news. Once we understand these patterns, once we can actually see them, then we can start to break free. And that's what we'll get into when we come back.
So before the break, we were talking about how society can really mess with our heads when it comes to these complexes, right? It's like we're all swimming in this soup of comparison and achievement, and it's hard to know which way is up sometimes.
Totally. And it's not like anyone's intentionally trying to make us feel bad, It's more like these messages about success and worth, they're just everywhere. They become part of the air we breathe.
Right. Like from the moment we're born, there's this whole set of expectations about what we should be doing, what we should be achieving.
Exactly. It's like, did you get into the right preschool?
Mm-hmm.
Are you on track for that Ivy League college? And then it's all about the corner office and the six-figure salary.
Mm-hmm.
And those messages, they're not always super obvious either.
It's not like everyone's going around with a loudspeaker.
Yeah.
It's more subtle, right?
Way more subtle. It could be something as simple as how we talk to kids about their accomplishments, or how much emphasis we put on certain professions over others. Like, why is being a doctor seen as inherently better than being an artist or a teacher or stay-at-home parent?
It's like those unspoken expectations, those subtle messages, they really do get under our skin, right?
Totally. And then, as if that pressure cooker wasn't enough, we add social media into the mix.
Oh yeah, don't even get me started on social media.
Right. It's like this amplified version of everything we're talking about. Suddenly, we're not just comparing ourselves to the people in our immediate lives, but to, like, everyone on the planet.
And not just everyone, but the best versions of everyone. Their highlight reels, perfectly curated and filtered.
Exactly. And we know it's not real, right?
Right.
Like, nobody's life is actually that perfect. But it's still so easy to get sucked in to start comparing our messy, behind-the-scenes reality to these glossy, airbrushed facades.
It's like an impossible standard. And that's where those feelings of inadequacy can really take root, right? We start to internalize those messages, those comparisons, and it's like this slow drip, drip, drip of self-doubt.
Totally. And that's when we end up either retreating into ourselves, feeling like we're not good enough, or we swing to the other extreme and overcompensate like crazy.
We're either hiding or we're shouting from the rooftops, trying to prove our worth. So knowing all of this, how do we actually break free? You mentioned self-compassion earlier, and I have to admit, I'm kind of intrigued.
Self-compassion is huge. It's like, instead of being our own worst critics, constantly beating ourselves up for every little mistake, we learn to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding we'd offer a close friend.
It's like we're giving ourselves permission to be human, flaws and all.
Exactly. And the research shows that this shift in perspective, it can make a world of difference. When we're more compassionate with ourselves, we're less likely to get caught in those spirals of self-doubt or feel the need to overcompensate. We start to realize that our worth It's not tied to our achievements or what other people think. It's just there,
Yeah,
inherently.
I love that. But how do we actually do that? How do we cultivate more self-compassion? It sounds great in theory, but putting it into practice feels a little, I don't know, abstract.
It starts with awareness. Pay attention to that inner critic, that voice in your head. Notice when it's being super harsh or judgmental. And then challenge those thoughts. Literally ask yourself, would I say this to a close friend? And if the answer is no, then why on earth are you saying it to yourself?
It's like holding up a mirror to those negative thought patterns, right? And asking, is this really true? Is this how I want to treat myself?
Precisely. And once you start to recognize those patterns, you can start to replace them with something more supportive, something kinder. Like instead of saying, "Ugh, I'm such a failure for not getting that promotion," try shifting it to, okay, so I didn't get this one. It's disappointing for sure, but it doesn't mean I'm a failure. There will be other opportunities.
It's like taking the power back, right? Reframing those setbacks as opportunities for growth instead of proof that we're not good enough.
You got it. And it takes time, it takes practice, but it's so worth it. Another game changer when it comes to these complexes, boundaries.
Okay, yes, boundaries. Tell me more about that.
Boundaries are like these invisible fences we put up to protect our time, our energy, our well-being. When we have healthy boundaries, we're able to say no to the things that drain us or don't align with our values.
Mm.
And we could do that without feeling guilty or like we have to over-explain ourselves.
It's about honoring our needs, which again, I think can be really tough, especially if we're used to putting everyone else's needs first.
100%.
Yeah.
And look, setting boundaries, it can feel really uncomfortable at first, especially if you're a natural people pleaser or you've been conditioned to believe that your worth depends on how much you do for others.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Boundaries aren't selfish. They're self-care.
They're like oxygen masks on an airplane. You have to put on your own mask first before you can help anyone else. So where do we even begin? How do we actually start setting these healthy boundaries?
It starts with getting clear on your values, your priorities, what's truly important to you. What are your non-negotiables? Once you know what you stand for, where your lines in the sand are, it becomes so much easier to say no when you need to.
It's about making conscious choices that are in alignment with who we are, even if it means saying no to things we might have said yes to in the past, right?
Exactly. And remember, it's an ongoing process. As our lives change, our boundaries might need to change too.
It's not a one and done kind of thing. It's a constant recalibration. Okay, so we've got self-compassion, setting boundaries. What else can help us break free from those patterns of inferiority and superiority?
This one might sound counterintuitive, but vulnerability, like really leaning into vulnerability.
Wait, really? Explain that one.
When we allow ourselves to be seen, imperfections and all, when we stop trying to present this perfect facade to the world, it actually opens the door for much deeper, more authentic connections with other people.
So you're saying that the more we try to hide our flaws, the more we're actually blocking ourselves from experiencing real connection. That's fascinating.
It's so true. Think about it. When we're constantly trying to be perfect, we're essentially putting up walls, keeping people at arm's length because we're so terrified of them seeing the real us.
Because we're afraid they won't like what they see, right?
Exactly. But the irony is it's those imperfections, those shared human experiences that actually bring us closer together. We connect through our vulnerability.
So how do we cultivate more vulnerability? It can feel scary to let those walls down, especially if we've been hurt before.
Baby steps. It could be as simple as sharing something you're struggling with a trusted friend, admitting you don't have all the answers, or asking for help when you need it.
It's about letting go of the need to be perfect, to have it all figured out.
Yes. And that takes courage
Yeah.
to show up as our authentic selves, even when it feels risky.
Okay, so much good stuff here. We've got self-compassion, setting boundaries, vulnerability. What about mindfulness? Where does that fit in?
Mindfulness is key. When we talk about mindfulness, we're talking about paying attention to the present moment without judgment. Just observing our thoughts and feelings without getting swept away by them.
So instead of getting stuck in those loops of self-doubt or feeling the need to prove ourselves, we're learning to just observe those thoughts and feelings without judgment.
Exactly. Mindfulness gives us that space between ourselves and our thoughts. That ability to recognize that our thoughts, they're not always facts. They're just thoughts. And we don't have to believe everything we think.
That's a game changer right there. So how do we actually practice mindfulness? Does it have to be all meditation all the time?
Meditation is great, but it's not the only way. Mindfulness can be woven into everyday life. Pay attention to your breath for a few moments. Notice the sensations of your feet on the ground as you walk. Really savor each bite of food.
It's about bringing our attention to the here and now, to whatever we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And the more we do it, the easier it becomes to catch those negative thought patterns before they spiral out of control.
So much good stuff to unpack here. As we start to wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important takeaway you want to leave our listeners with today?
You are worthy of love and belonging just as you are. Imperfections and all. Embrace your true self, cultivate self-compassion, and never forget you are not alone on this journey.
Beautifully said. Okay, listeners, we've covered a lot of ground today, but don't worry, we're not done yet. In our final segment, we're going to dive into some practical tips and techniques for putting all of this into practice in your everyday life. So stick around.
Okay, so we've spent this whole time, this whole deep dive, really digging into these complexes, these patterns of inferiority and superiority, how they take root in our lives, how they can even, mess with our relationships.
Right, and the million-dollar question, right?
What can we actually do about it?
Exactly. Because, I mean, information is great, don't get me wrong, but if we don't put it to use...
It's like having a toolbox full of tools, but never actually building anything.
Exactly. So are you ready to get practical?
Let's do it. What's the first tool we're grabbing?
Gratitude. Cultivating a daily gratitude practice.
Oh, I love that. Isn't there a saying like, comparison is the thief of joy, and gratitude is like the antidote, right? And it's not just some woo-woo feel-good thing.
Yeah.
The research actually shows that taking even just a few minutes each day to really appreciate what's good in our lives, it can have a huge impact on our brains. It's like we're retraining ourselves to see what we have rather than what we don't have.
Okay, so not ignoring the tough stuff,
Yeah.
not pretending everything's perfect, but making that conscious choice to focus on what's going well.
Exactly. So what does a gratitude practice actually look like, right?
Yeah, what does that look like?
I mean, it can be so simple. Keep a gratitude journal, make it a ritual to tell someone what you're grateful for every day, or just take a few minutes every day to think about all the good things, all the good people in your life.
Love that. Okay, so we talked earlier about challenging those negative thoughts, the ones that, can really feed these complexes. How do we actually do that?
Those negative thoughts are tricky, I'm telling you. They're sneaky. They become such a normal part of our inner dialogue, we often don't even realize they're running the show. So first, just notice them. What's the tone of that voice in your head? Is it harsh, mean, critical?
It's like tuning into that radio station that's always playing in the background of our minds and actually listening to the lyrics for once.
Yes. And once you start noticing them, then you can start to question them. Are those thoughts actually true? Do you have any proof? A lot of times, those negative thoughts are based on old, outdated beliefs, things that might not even be true anymore.
We put them on trial, cross-examine them, see if they hold up.
Exactly. And then here's the key. Reframe them. Flip the script. Instead of saying, I'm such a failure because I messed that up at work, maybe try something like, okay, so I messed up, but everyone makes mistakes, right? What can I learn from this?
We have to be kinder to ourselves.
So much kinder. Okay, what else? Oh, boundaries. Boundaries are huge, especially when those old, inferior or superior patterns start creeping back in.
Yes, boundaries. I want to talk more about that.
Yeah.
How do we actually set them and actually keep them, especially when it's uncomfortable?
It takes practice, like building a muscle. You have to start by getting really clear on what you need, what you're willing to put up with, and what you're absolutely not okay with.
Or your non-negotiables, what really matters.
Yes, and once you know your boundaries, communicate them clearly and assertively. You're allowed to say no without feeling guilty or like you have to explain yourself.
Like you're honoring yourself.
Yeah.
Honoring what you need, even if it means, disappointing other people, which, let's be honest, is hard.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a people pleaser.
It is hard. But when we set those boundaries and we do it from a place of self-respect, it strengthens our relationships because everything's out in the open.
It creates a more honest dynamic, right?
Totally. Okay, I'm going to throw one more out there. Embrace imperfection.
Oh, I love that. What does that actually look like in our day-to-day lives, though?
Look, we live in a culture that is obsessed with perfection. But here's a little secret. Perfection doesn't exist. It's made up.
I'm blown.
Right. So embracing imperfection, it means letting go of that need to be perfect, Accepting yourself, flaws and all.
It's like giving ourselves permission to just be human.
And you know what? Often, those imperfections are where the magic happens. That's where we grow the most, where we connect the most deeply. It's in those messy human moments.
I love that. This has been incredible. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, is there one final thought, one last bit of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
You are worthy of love and belonging, just as you are. imperfections and all.
Yes.
Embrace who you are, cultivate compassion for yourself, and remember, you are not alone.
That is so beautifully said. And to our amazing listeners, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep growing, and we'll catch you next time.